Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about government budget. Government budget is essentially the government's annual financial plan. It outlines how the government collects money and how it plans to spend that money over the year. By studying the budget, we can understand the government's priorities and how fiscal policy affect the economy. When you talk about government budget, we usually divide it into two parts, revenues and expenditures. Revenues come mainly from taxes, while expenditures represent everything the government pays for, such as public services, infrastructure, pensions, and defense. The difference between these two, determines whether the government is running a deficit or a surplus. If spending exceeds revenue, the government must borrow to make up the difference. To set a federal budget in United States, there are four processes to carry out: submission, resolution, appropriation, and approval. It begins with the president proposing a budget, which outlines spending priorities and tax proposals. And then Congress reviews the proposal, debates it, and makes revisions through the appropriations process. Both the House and Senate must pass the budget legislation, and the president signs it into the law. Throughout this process, the political negotiation plays a major role, and the final budget reflects the compromise uh, among economic goals, political priorities, and constraints. The federal budget can be divided into three major components: mandatory spending, discretionary spending, and interest payments on the national debt. Mandatory spending is the largest portion in United States. These programs grow automatically as more people retire or qualify for benefits. Because they're written into law, Congress must change the law itself to alter spending on programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. This makes the mandatory spending relatively, inflexible and a major driver of long-term budget trends. Here is discretionary spending, which Congress negotiates each year. Defense spending is the largest discretionary category, covering the military, veterans, and defense-related activities. Non-defense discretionary spending includes uh, education, transportation, housing programs, environmental protection, and scientific research. Since these programs are not automatic, they are often the focus, of the political debates about spending cuts or expansions. The third component is interest on the national debt. This represents the payments the government must make to bondholders who have lent money to the US. This is an obligation that must be paid each year and cannot be skipped. This chart illustrates how federal spending is divided across categories in 2019. You can see that the mandatory programs such as Social Security and healthcare take up the largest share, like 36, 36.5%. Defense spending is another significant portion, 15.4%. All other spending, including transportation, education, international affairs, and science and research, takes up about the 40%. This breakdown helps us understand why adjusting the federal budget is challenging. Most of the budget is devoted to large, politically sensitive programs. Here, we look at how federal spending has changed over time. If we examine trends since 1960, we see that federal spending typically fluctuates between 80% and 22% of the GDP. During recessions or crises such as 2008 and or 2020, total spending spikes as the government increases financial support for individuals and businesses. This trend reveals how economic conditions shape the federal spending patterns. Mandatory spending has grown steadily due to aging populations and rising healthcare costs, and the discretionary spending has remained relatively stable or even declined as a share of GDP. State and local governments play a crucial role in the economy. They provide services people interact with daily, including public schools, police and fire departments, road maintenance, and local public health services. Their spending priorities differ from the federal level. The single biggest spending item for state and local governments is education, including K-12 schools and public universities, which has consistently accounted for about 4 to 5% of GDP for decades. Unlike the federal government, most states must balance their budget without the running deficits. This means they often cut spending or raise taxes during downturns, which can sometimes make recessions worse unless federal assistance is provided. When analyzing government spending or debt, economists often express these amounts as a percentage of GDP. Using GDP ratios instead of raw dollar values helps us compare across years and across countries. A large economy can, comfortably sustain a larger debt in absolute terms. What matters is the size of debt relative to the economy's ability to generate income. The debt to GDP ratio gives us a better measure of fiscal sustainability. Now let's look at the revenue side, or where the money comes from. The federal government relies on individual income taxes, payroll taxes for Social Security and Medicare, and corporate income taxes. In contrast, state and local governments get their money from sales taxes, property taxes, and various fees for services like water and trash. They also receive a large amount of revenue passed along, directly from the federal government. Did you know the federal government relies on income taxes and payroll taxes? Income taxes are, collected from households and businesses, while payroll taxes fund Social Security and Medicare. Additional revenue comes from corporate taxes, excise taxes on, goods like, gasoline and cigarette, custom duties and fees. Most importantly, federal tax collection is based on a progressive system, meaning tax rates increase as income rises. Higher income households pay a larger percentage of their income, while lower income households, pay a smaller share. A common point of confusion is the marginal tax rate. This is the tax percentage applied only to the last dollar you earned. It does not apply to, your entire income. For example, using a table below, if a person earns, $35,000, the person's marginal tax rate is just, 15%. The US operates on a pay-as-you-go tax system. It means that, you pay taxes throughout the year as you receive income. Through continuous withholding, your employer sends a portion of your paycheck directly to the government to provide the stable money flow. The tax day on April 15 is not necessarily the day you pay your taxes, but rather the day you reconcile, your accounts, the calculating the actual tax owed versus what was withheld. This audit determines if you receive a refund for, overpaying or all the balance for underpaying. Looking at the long-term trends, federal tax revenues have consistently hovered between the 70% and the 20% of GDP. Individual income taxes and payroll taxes remain the primary engines of federal revenue, while corporate income taxes were also once a larger share. They now provide a much smaller portion of total revenue compared to the mid 20th century. To wrap up, the state and local tax revenues have generally increased over time to keep pace with the rising cost of services they provide. By matching their revenue to their spending, these governments manage the local infrastructure and education system that we rely on every day. Thank you for watching.